Good morning, friends. Welcome to WordofGord OBE Journal 2017, number 20, I believe. I've been allowing myself to merge for the last few moments before signing on into the chorus of birdsong here in the pre-dawn hours. And in doing so was reminded, or am reminded, of how one merges with one's visual and audio surroundings. One gives up that sort of need or ability to objectify or judge or, clarify, define, and just become lost, as it were, in the audio effects. And this it's an exercise. It's a meditative exercise, giving up one's ability to be the, or seeming ability to be the center of not action, but perception of action. And that's connected with one's ego and one's sense of, you are the center, everything's going on around you. And you are, if not of course, not directing it, but processing it. And moves you to a state where you are just another moving part in the big picture of moving parts. And this reminded me of very recently, obviously, being in theater / cinema in the astral plane with many others who appeared to be, permanent astral residents, as we call them, as opposed to nighttime visitors. And as I recall or shall I say, place myself with consciousness back in that experience, and hopefully bring you with me, the unfolding of the storyline becomes more apparent to me. And I see that it's a common experience there that you can more easily enter the perceptions, prejudices, background of life background that makes up motivations of the characters. And as one enters, if one wishes, the background of motivational, how shall I put it, triggers for a certain character, the action seems to stop and you move into that character's life and memory. And in a sense of a sort of a stop motion, you enter it and everything around you stops, at least in your perception it does. And as I follow my own experience of this, which seems quite natural and without intellectual construction beforehand, shall we say. There's no sense of planning to do this. It just seems to be what happens. You can get quite, here's that word again, lost in that character's myriad of I'll call them motivational triggers, and maybe even in the the Freudian sense of childhood and parenting, and sort of knock around inside that character's head, if you like. And but as I step back from that perceptive interaction of me there, I see that the story does go on. The action does continue in a natural rhythm. It doesn't stop. But it appears to stop as you move into it. It's like, the pause button. Inside yourself, you go and press a pause button. It doesn't affect others' perceptions. Yes, let's put it that way. And one seems to be able to do this with minor characters, not just the sort of major, protagonists that you're keenly following, but minor characters that are just walk-ons for 15 seconds, 30 seconds. One is able to do this. It can be sort of, I'm guessing it could be confusing. You would just get lost in motivational details. But I seem to be able to do this without getting lost, which suggests to me that it's a normal, regular experience over there. So I'm pulling back in terms of my identification with Gordon there and what he seems to be experiencing, and pulling back my consciousness, and do come with me as we kind of survey the audience. And I feel that this, what I've just described, is a choice. It's an aesthetic choice that not everyone makes. And some people are quite happy with the surface level of the story. And another thing, so again, it's just a personal choice. And the consensus reality is, to use that as a metaphor for, the larger communities on the astral plane where, one acts within a consensus reality. Is not affected by one's personal take or interaction with or manipulation of that that consensus reality. So you can go into that consensus reality, whether it's the cinema or the the life of the community, and manipulate it to your own ends, without that sounding ominous, and without affecting the overall consensus reality. It's flexible in that way. And I'm not sure. I think that sounds like an insight, doesn't it? I'm tempted to sort of say, isn't it that way here? One can certainly analyze in a cinema here. One can certainly analyze the plot the unfolding of the plot or the motivations of characters as, as an intellectual, analytical exercise in one's own brain as the story moves along. And I'm sure we all do to one degree or another. But it does seem to be more detailed and penetrative here in the astral plane. And yes, what other perceptions are there? That there seems to be an ability to view as the plot unfolds in a linear fashion. The a vision that seems to be similar to the extras that we now get on DVDs, where amongst other things they might show you how they rehearsed or set up a certain scene, and in that showing they'll have a camera that shows the entire set rather than just what's in front of the camera. The cameraman, the director sitting on his chair, the lighting director, the various creative staff that are behind the camera working on a second-to-second basis as the scenes are done. And now I seem to be able to do this as projected Gordon sits there. And maybe that's because I'm a long-time film buff and I enjoy that sort of thing, although I'd have to admit that it takes away from the magic of the unfolding, in somewhat in the same way when you do a regression and go back to a pre-birth situation where you're discussing the setup of your incarnation and how you're going to have certain situations and trends and sort of things occur so that you can experience them and react to them in a certain way and learn certain lessons. When one does that, it can be quite a startling discovery, of course, but it can also be a way of removing the magic of, existence, as it were. Because you see the machinations behind the scene. And there's a certain childlike sort of glee and wonder in the mystery of unfolding existence. And these two experiences I just mentioned can undermine that. And if you, although perhaps it can lead to a greater sense of mystery, which lends itself to the notion that as we explore the great mystery of existence and get to a certain level of pulling it apart and seeing what's behind the scenes, as it were, and gaining a deeper understanding, there's this sense that it's a layer of the onion thing. You penetrate one layer, feel that you understand it, and then wind up moving on to the next layer of the onion. It's still more mystery. And when I've discussed this with others, there seems to be this sense of the mystery of existence comes down to why are we here in the first place? Why are we anywhere in the first place? And to me, that's a metaphysical conundrum that can be resolved, and it has been by me anyway, by Gordon in this life. And it seems to me we're just exercising ourselves, stretching ourselves, and learning more and more tricks of the trade. And the trade being incarnation on this plane, on this planet, and at other times and places, other incarnations on other planets. And we haven't explored that much, but it's definitely, as far as I'm concerned, true. And many of you are perhaps at a stage where you're exploring your human incarnations, or some of them, and understanding that there's probably almost certainly more, but you're feeling out or focusing on 2, 3, 4, 5 that seem relevant and important to you. And I can certainly remember living that stage myself. Maybe 20, 25 years ago, I'm not quite sure. This notion of reading in esoteric books, metaphysical books, that we have dozens, maybe hundreds of incarnations, and but only sensing 4 or 5 yourself, and pondering why you were only sensing 4 or 5. And although the 4 or 5 that you were exploring through meditation would be quite sort of seemingly significant and important to your current character, but you couldn't quite get the significance of dozens of others. And so the unfolding stages, and you move from one, you penetrate one mystery, and then you penetrate the next, and on it goes. And does the unfolding of mysteries ever end? Do you ever get to the center of the onion? And I think we do. We do both in the series of stages and also in meditation. You can certainly get to the center of the onion for whatever, seconds, minutes, and stay there in meditation. Feel that divine consciousness in all its marvelous potential, and somehow see that each incarnation is a realization of part of that potential. And then, that can be a challenging thing to hold focused in your consciousness for long periods, but it can be done fairly easily for short periods. At least in my experience, it can. And I would encourage you to follow that trail when you can. So I haven't left the cinema yet. The projection of Gordon to the cinema, and obviously I was projected somewhere else before that. And we'll try to follow the trails of that. Certainly the aesthetic points of the art form that we think of as film or cinema over there are more refined, more detailed, but everything is on the astral plane. Everything's more refined and detailed. One's consciousness is on a higher level of perception overall. And the vibrations, of course, are much higher. And so things like textures, colors, shades are all much more fascinatingly detailed in movies there. And one can certainly with ease focus in on the, how shall I put it, the aesthetic structure of a background detail in any one scene. And again, as one does that, the action seems to stop. It doesn't for anyone else, but it does for you as you focus in on a certain, the way certain colors and textures intermingle, not in the foreground, but in the background. And you, just in the way that you might do with a painting in a museum. Although the painting's not moving, of course. But you're there and you can focus on any detail that you wish. And it doesn't seem to disturb the unfolding action for anyone else, whether they're doing the same thing you are or just watching the flow of the storyline in a, quote unquote linear fashion. And as I'm connecting to this, projected experience, I'm recalling now as I talk to you other movies, more, how shall I say, experimental movies on the astral plane where certain aspects of a character's makeup or aspects of the storyline can be not flashed on the screen, but put on a small rectangular sort of box at the edge of the screen. And you can look at the details in that and the main thing at the same time. And that can be done quite creatively, of course, and reflect on the characters and the action in various ways, in a sardonic way, in a satirical way, in an analytical way, And I suppose those sort of movies would be considered sort of arty or, not mainstream. Because obviously a lot of people, many souls pass into the astral plane with a taste for, those sort of mainstream blockbuster action thriller type films. And the exciting unfolding of action is what, appeals to them, not the slow, analytical details of pertaining to psychology and sociology and aesthetics that some of us might enjoy. So, I mean, again, that's nothing particularly surprising. The life on the astral plane with its challenges and joys and what's the word I'm looking for? Activities, education, hobbies, it appeals to the broad spectrum of humanity that's there. And whatever I explore, whatever Gordon explores in this series of video journals is always just part of the picture. There's always going to be something that I'm not going to cover. Something, many things. And that's just a caveat, I guess. There's always that. And just as our life here in this world, in the physical plane, is to some degree limited by our aesthetic choices or the character, the overall character of our ethnicity, in the way that, although we're all humanity, people in the West, Europe, North America, have certain cultural preferences, and people in the Middle East and the Far East have their own cultural preferences, and all of which we should honor and recognize, and I think we do, without going into detail. I don't think it really matters, at least not to me it doesn't, and everyone has their cultural traditions and attitudes, and that is obviously reflected there. There are multicultural communities, and where people blend quite successfully, and others that are more monocultural, just like here. And there's different, types of experiences and learning situations to be accessed in either situation. And perhaps that's an obvious point to be making about the astral plane, but I just would emphasize it for a moment. And after the movie, I'm sort of looking at the experience that Gordon had a few hours ago in his projection. I can shuffle it forward in time here. And afterwards, I see myself in some sort of cafe lobby, doing just almost what we do here, sipping on a latte or something that sure tastes like one, and sitting with some others who are chatting about the structure and their experience of the movie, just very much in the same way we do here, and just being friendly, attentive in a friendly way, and enjoying the discussion and the people's reactions to it. And I'm not sure if they realize I'm just a visitor, and they all seem to have the vibration of permanent astral residence, and to put it in an amusing way, they're quite comfortable with being dead, and don't think about it much anymore. And because you go through that phase of, oh my God, I'm dead, and and all your various reactions, like, oh, it really is, there is a life here. All the stories were true, and the various reactions that people have, often relief, often puzzlement, but they get past that and they just begin to live the life and enjoy it. So I just sit there enjoying my drink and listening in, and it seems to be a group of friends, and who've just included me in their table talk without specifically alluding to me or nodding to me or whatever, and eventually this female spirit sitting next to me, who's part of the group, the largest table with 5 to 6 people right there, in the midst of a sort of a very comfortable, relaxed cafe type atmosphere with counters where you just go and order what you would like and come and sit down. And a female spirit next to me turns and says, "You don't look like you're here all the time. Are you just passing through?" And I say, "Yes, I am. I'm consciously projected from a sleep state, and this experience here will be somehow compressed and in a few hours and related to others on a video blog on YouTube." And I say that assuming that she knows what I'm talking about. And people that have passed in the last few years do understand that. Whereas, people that have maybe passed 40, 50 years ago won't get that unless they've kept up and been checking. And she nods and smiles. "Oh, yes, right." And she asks about that and says, "That sounds like an interesting project for you." And I said, it is. It's very interesting. And it is of interest to others too. And I'm pleased to see that. And I explain further about some of my attitudes, and explain the point about how many of us here who attempt to practice conscious projection or lucid dreaming, or out-of-body experience, given the situation, its various tags and names, uh, have this perception, sensation that we are having these experiences, but only occasionally. And the remembered experiences, the vividness of the memory is dulled after one experience for a number of days or weeks before we have another. And that I'm trying to illustrate that we do it every night and only remember some of the nights, and only remember for two or three reasons, I think. One is some of the methods that people use are challenging to replicate on a day-to-day basis, and take a certain level of energy that is hard to replicate day to day. And that the other reason is the normal day-to-day consciousness of these explorers needs to be stabilized and maintained. And one of the ways of doing that is not to remember too much of our actual multidimensionality, because that can trouble and upset the lower elements of one's consciousness that are attached to the belief systems and consensus realities in which we live our day-to-day lives. You don't want to remember too much, because it can be upsetting, and it can make you feel that your physical plane life is rather dull and predictable and actually quite boring. And in order to have a sort of productive learning experience in your incarnation, you need to minimize that perception and try to find joy and expression and creativity and challenge in your physical plane life. And she sort of nods, and I can see that she hasn't maybe given much thought to this, that maybe didn't do this sort of thing when she was physically alive. And she is quite enthused and gives me much encouragement, saying that it sounds like a fascinating project. And in a way, she wishes she was back on Earth as a physical person, watching these videos to see how they would. And then she sort of explains that she didn't think much about that sort of thing when she was alive and physically alive in her last incarnation, and just went on a sort of trust that life had some meaning in the post-mortem period. And she seems to have, she's not giving me any details, but she's sort of explaining her position, or her perception of her position, and saying that work and family as an adult in her last life completely absorbed her, and she didn't have much quote unquote time to explore the more subtle mysteries of existence. And I ask her, does she regret that now? And she says, once in a while. And then she adds that life there on the astral plane is so much fun and so involving once you surrender to the fact that you are dead and you're not going back, that there's a similar sensation of being totally involved in life there. She was totally involved in life there, and she sort of flashes me images of getting up early, getting her children ready to go to school. I think she had two, and the busyness of a mother housewife, career professional, I think. Yes, yes, I'm getting images of that too. And uh, and she's not talking about how she passed, but I think it was some kind of an illness that took her away, and maybe she doesn't care to think about that. And it may have been, some quote unquote years ago. She seems to have been there for, I'm guessing, a good decade anyway. Certainly enough time to get accustomed to, how things unfolded. And the fellow next to her sort of turns from his conversation and sort of tunes into what we're talking about, and then looks over to me and says, "Ah, you're just visiting." And I smile and go, "Yes, I am just passing through." And he, the smile on his face, I guess, suggests to her, the lady next to me, of his interest, and so she quickly recounts her perception of my, project, and he chuckles and let me see, what did he say? He's obviously not been that long there, a year or so, and remembers his internet fixations, and starts talking about watching all sorts of video on his cell phone as he traveled to and from work. That's right, traveled to and from work. And that was after, why is he telling me this? That was after he'd lost his license through 2 or 3 careless, reckless driving charges, and he only lost his license for a few months, but he didn't bother getting it back. He got happy with transit, and then he was killed in an accident himself. But he seems quite attuned to that. He's not full of regrets or self-recrimination or whatever. And but he's just sort of reacting to her telling him about my project and his own fascination with, obsession even with internet based activity on his phone as he traveled to and from work. And he wishes me well with the project, and he says it sounds like a lot of fun. And I said it is. And it's fascinating to me how actually, even though I'm projecting or remembering projecting, every night for the last few weeks, it's amazing how little of the actual experience I can get across, because it is in fact so varied and detailed and, dare I say it, multidimensional. And he asks if even the little that I can get across is worthwhile, and I say, yes, it is. It is definitely worthwhile. And it just sort of contravenes or contradicts what I sort of unconsciously expected might happen. And the sort of complete picture that I was hoping for is reduced to more sort of headlines and, précis of the storyline, as it were. I said, you just can't get it all across. There isn't the time. And let's face it, who's going to want to watch something that would be hours long? I said, it's bad enough that it's 30, 40 minutes long every night. And he laughs at that. And he said, well, tell your watchers that that I perhaps didn't, what does he say? Let me try and get this. I didn't take full advantage of all my opportunities and took the easy way out rather too often in my life. But I'm accustomed to that. I've reconciled to that, and I have no regrets, and I'm enjoying my life as a dead person. He said it's quite marvelous, and all of you should tell your watchers that whatever you experience in your physical plane life is complemented and extended by what you experience here. And regardless of how much attention you were paying when you were physically alive, it can still be an incredibly enjoyable and worthwhile experience here. You don't have to be any kind of a special person to enjoy your afterlife. And again, that's, I'm giving you my perception of his thoughts there. And he's raising his drink to you and saluting you. And I said, well, thank you. They'll appreciate that. And I tell them I'm going to move on now because it's enough of an experience for one episode. And they say bye, goodbye, and see you again sometime. And I nod and walk off. And I think that's probably good enough for today. Astral Plane Cinemas. And I should add, there's the shopping malls and all sorts of things there on certain levels. There's levels where there's people live in small villages and in a rural atmosphere, and the last thing that they need is a shopping mall. And they go to little smaller stores where craftspersons, people who do all sorts of crafts, sell, trade and sell their wares. And I'm talking anything from jewelry to hand-carved, tables and chairs and artwork of all kinds. And so the commercial experience is as varied as you would like it to be. Just a small point there. And until tomorrow, I bid you farewell.